It's my great pleasure to welcome Al Rapaport, who joins us from Open Mind Zen. Today we're talking about the Heart Sutra, which is the heart of Zen Buddhist teaching.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So for those of you who don't know me, I think most of you do. I've been coming here for quite a few years, but I'm the founder director of Open Mind Zen. We started here in Melbourne in 2001, and we now have groups all over the world, actually, about 7 or 8 different groups. So the topic that I'd like to speak about today is a section of the Heart Sutra. So the Heart Sutra is not about Valentine's Day, although it may sound like it. I guess it could be, actually, but not usually. The Heart Sutra is considered the heart of Zen teaching. For those of you who don't know, Gautama Buddha lived about 2,600 years ago, and there's a vast amount of information from his teaching because he lived during a time when the teaching was respected, number one. But number two, he was alive for about 50 plus years. He taught for about 50 plus years, I'm sorry. He was alive into his mid-80s, actually. And so he traveled and taught for 50 years throughout India. There was no writing at that time in India, but they had bards, storytellers, remember a lot of what he said, and then it was written down, supposedly, if you believe the histories, about 300 to 500 years later after he died. In any event, the Heart Sutra is about a page-long text that is taken from a part of a much longer sutra, just one of the Buddha's sutras. And I think it's 86,000 pages. That's just one of them. So a lot of information there. But the Heart Sutra itself is only about a page long. And this section, or these few lines that I'll be talking about today, I think could be valuable to people as they're learning to work with the stresses of whatever's going on in our life, whether it's the political situation, health situations, relationship situations, that are challenging our ability to maintain our equanimity and joy. And so the lines go, thus bodhisattvas live prajnaparamita, which is the Heart Sutra, with no hindrance in the mind, therefore no fear. So no fear, therefore this is nirvana. So the notion of nirvana in Buddhism is very different from heaven, something that occurs in an afterlife of some sort. And I'm not saying that there isn't an afterlife. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure. But nirvana, in this sense, is on planet Earth or not. And I say on or not because it has to do with how our mind is, how we are personally. Normally, we're kind of battered one way or another by outside circumstances, as some people have cited today, for instance, the political situation, which you can agree or disagree with. But no matter who's the president or who we're in a relationship with or what body we have, we're going to have to deal with high level of challenge at one point or another in our life. So then how do we deal with that? And unfortunately, if we're not trained to look at it in a different way, we tend to go into the fight or flight syndrome. In other words, we take a situation which, it may or may not be a life or death situation. It often isn't a life or death situation. Often the things that put us into a fight or flight syndrome are not they're not going to kill us, but it feels like it's going to kill us. And so we go into this state of mind where we're under a high level of stress. And stress, as we know now, the last 50 years or so, there's been a lot of research about this, especially more recently, that stress actually has a very negative effect on our bodies as well as our mind. So in the Heart Sutra, they're talking about, in this particular line, we're talking about hindrances in the mind. So hindrances in this sense are whatever's in the way of us living in a free and open manner. So in other words, if we're encountering something and it's creating a feeling within us of block, like we're feeling blocked or we're feeling highly triggered, that would be considered a hindrance. And the way we deal with hindrances in this sense is to move through them, to allow ourselves to experience the energy of the hindrance without giving in to the notion that the hindrance is a product of something outside of ourselves. So normally we think that other things in our life, other people or other situations are responsible for our happiness. But from the Zen perspective, we learn to take responsibility for our reactions, and our reactions are what determine what our experience of life is, not necessarily the outside circumstances. So, I mean, all of us would prefer that everything went the way we wanted it to, that we had a healthy body, that the political situation was the way we wanted it, that we had an amazing relationship that met all of our needs. That just doesn't happen very often except for short periods of time. And even if one of those things does occur in our life, the other will pop up sooner or later. And as we know, everything is impermanent. So even if something's in a great situation now, there's a good chance later it will not be. So if we learn to rely on our own inner resources and work with our reactivity so that the hindrances are seen through, then we go into a very different way of relating to our life and to the various things that may trigger us or the various things that we regard as being in our way. So there's a lot of ways of working with hindrances. In the Zen school, traditionally, the main way that we worked with hindrances is through the process of meditation and getting in touch with the ways in which we kind of get locked into a conceptual matrix which may not accurately reflect reality. Believe it or not, that often happens. We can believe something is true, and yet it may not be. And unfortunately, what happens when people gather together in tribes and societies and cultures and nations, organizations, we tend to reinforce our biases rather than, at least in many instances, explore the idea that there may be some other perspective. And so meditation is an important step towards getting in touch with the way that we create suffering. So the teachings of the Buddha were not really transcendental teachings in the same sense as some of the other great spiritual teachers, because the Buddha wasn't talking about the future, like when you die, it will be amazing then. It was always about how to relieve suffering in our life as it is now. And when we relieve our suffering, then we're often able to then help others in their journey of relieving suffering. And suffering in this case would be not pain, because pain specifically can't be avoided. If we have a human body, we're going to experience pain, all different kinds. But suffering, in the way that the Buddha was talking about it, was our reactivity to that pain. So in other words, I stub my toe, there's pain. But then what happens after that? I can't avoid the fact that I stubbed my toe after it's happened, and I can't avoid the fact that some level of pain is there, maybe a little bit, maybe a lot. But then what do I do with what happened? Do I get angry? Do I start yelling at people because they left something in the middle of the room that I stubbed my toe on? Do I then go into recrimination because why was I so stupid as to stub my toe? And then I might even get down on myself for being angry and having recrimination, which means I've created about, 3 or 4, maybe 5 layers of additional suffering on top of just the pain of striking my toe. I like using that metaphor, or that example rather, because it's something we all experience. And if we look at it carefully, we do all experience creating narratives, creating stories on top of sensory experience. And when we layer these narratives that are often not very useful for us and often are quite negative for us, when we layer those narratives on top of the actual experience, then that spreads, and it's kind of cancerous. It's similar to how a cancer can spread throughout the body. Those waves of our suffering tend to go out into our life, affect those around us, and then it spreads, the suffering spreads. And so when we deal with the hindrances as something that we're creating, it gives us a kind of agency. It gives us an agency so that we are not having to experience the suffering attached to the painful or triggering incidents that we experience in our life. Now, this is a practice, of course, and no one is perfect at this. I'm certainly not even close. I mean, I've been doing this kind of stuff for over 50 years, and I still find things every day that trigger me that I need to work with. But when our attitude is that rather than, well, that person did it to me, or this situation is doing it to me, when that's not our attitude, and our attitude is, how am I reacting to that person in the way they are? How am I reacting to the situation I find around me? By the way, this doesn't mean we can't be concerned. It doesn't mean we can't be socially active. It has nothing to do with any of that. It just means that we don't need to suffer about it. In fact, the more we're suffering, the less clearly we can move forward and do something about a situation we believe is unfair, unjust, or whatever. The more we're suffering, the less clearly we can see a path forward that really may work, because we're tied up in the suffering of the situation and lack of clarity. So this teaching from 2,600 years ago is a blueprint for how to live a life free of any particular philosophy even. This is not really a philosophy, it's a practice. It doesn't matter what religion you are, it doesn't matter what social background you're from. If you're a human being, you can practice these kinds of techniques of working with the mind and learning to see through hindrances and work with them in a way that creates more joy and more awakening rather than more suffering and more pain for people and for the earth and the universe and everything around us. So in Buddhism, there are what's called the three poisons, and the three poisons are greed, anger, and ignorance. And these teachings are not unique to Buddhism. I mean, they're quite practical. So the poisons are greed, of course, we know what that is. Anger, we know what that is. And ignorance, from the Buddhist perspective, is not being aware of what's real, not being aware of what's real. So if we're not aware of what's real, it's hard to move forward in a clear manner to work with that material, whatever's arising. In other words, if I'm walking, and this has happened actually to me, if I'm walking through my backyard and I think there's a snake there and I jump back and fall over and hurt myself, but then I get up and oh, this is really just a hose. I've actually had this happen. I'm not afraid of the black snakes so much, but that used to be around here. There was a lot more open land, and I'd find rattlesnakes occasionally in my yard and things like that. So I was careful where I stepped. So in other words, that was ignorance. In other words, I was ignorant of what it really was because I wasn't being mindful enough to see that it was a hose instead of a snake until afterwards. So that's an example of ignorance. And there are so many instances where we think we know what's going on, but we haven't taken the time to really be mindful and aware of a situation enough to clearly see what's actually going on. This is especially true in interpersonal relationships. And the reason why this is common is that it's difficult. I think that things that are that are clear are difficult because they require a kind of focus and perseverance with mindfulness that not everyone's willing to apply to a situation. It's much easier to be reactive until, of course, we start having all kinds of health problems because of our reactivity and our stress. Then it's not so fun anymore. And then we try and medicate that, which works to some extent, but it doesn't really solve the key question there of why it's being created in the first place, why we are creating it in the first place. So just to sum up in closing, I'll say that meditation can certainly be a method to become more aware. Certainly other methods, there are psychotherapeutic modalities, prayer, but also simply being mindful of situations and being as aware as we can be of what's going on somatically within our body and mind, because that's key. If something doesn't feel right within the body-mind, we say it's the same really in Zen. We say body/mind. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And so at times we need to really put extra energy into, well, what's really going on? And sometimes the best way to do that is to sit down and stop for a while. Stopping doesn't seem like maybe we're doing anything, but actually if you've ever meditated, you know that you're doing a lot when you're sitting there. In fact, that's one of the big issues with people meditating is they say, well, I can't stop my thinking. My answer to that is, we don't have to, just be aware. So maybe I'll open it up for a few minutes for questions. I always find that questions are helpful in terms of clarifying things for people, and